good morning, good afternoon. Hello and welcome to the CGHE seminar, webinar 307. I'm Alma Maldonado. I am a researcher at the Departamento de Investigaciones Educativas, CINVESTAV. And today we will be hearing from Catherine Walsh. She is a professor at the Universidad Andina, Simón Bolívar in Ecuador. She's now in Quito. On higher education and knowledge in Latin America, past, present, and future series. This is a webinar number four, on epistemic injustice, decolonization, and the potentials of intercultural education. We also will be hearing from some remarks from Professor Regina Cortina. She's at Teachers College at the University of Columbia, and I'm sure all of you know both Professor Catherine and Professor Regina. And before I hand over, now Trevor will present us some housekeeping information.
Sorry, Emma, you read the script on that. I'm just sharing the slides for you.
So this is the information that about the webinar is going to be recorded, and we will be posted online at the CGHE website tomorrow morning. So a transcript of that chat function conversation will be also posted. And also I would like to remind you that please keep yourself muted unless you have been asked to speak or ask a question. There is no need to have your video on during the webinar, but please so do when asking a question. We recommend using the speaker view so you can more clearly see who is talking. To ask a question, use the chat function and write out the question you wish to ask. At the end of your presentation, if your question is selected, you will be invited to ask it yourself directly. When invited to ask a question, please unmute yourself, switch on your video, and state your name and where you are from. So now I will pass over to Catherine for today's webinar. And thank you very much for being here with us this afternoon, this morning, and thank you, Catherine, and thank you, Regina.
Thank you, Alma. I also want to thank Simon Marginson, who organized and invited me to this webinar, and also thank Regina for the comments that she's going to make afterwards. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on what geography and what calendar you're at. I want to begin by recalling the cry of student protests here in Ecuador more than a decade ago now against education policies of the then progressive state. And the cry was, the university is of the people, not the government, of the people. Thousands and thousands of students shouted. But we can ask, what people? Some of us asked that then. When higher education, particularly here in Latin America, remains primarily a white and whitened enterprise with a clearly male ethos. With what knowledge and whose knowledge is, we can also ask. And knowledge is for what? Knowledge allied with the interests of capital and the project and the logic of global coloniality, or as many in the region argue, knowledge of and for life. Such questions, of course, are pertinent not just here in Latin America, but in many places in the globe, I'm sure, as many of the participants listening today well know. But they're particularly important here in Latin America, or what many of us prefer to call Avayala, the territory and place where coloniality took form 530 years ago and continues today in different configurations, mutations, especially in these times of pandemics, in which COVID, systemic racism, gendered violences, and increased impoverishment intertwine. So my comments, reflections today take root in this reality, in the reality of higher education as we are living it in Latin America today, but also in the presence of what I'll describe as decolonial fissures or cracks, which I understand as spaces of epistemic interculturalizations, decolonizations, and pluriversalizations within, despite, and despite the system and the structures of higher education. So in the comments that I'm going to make, I'm organizing them in three central ideas or parts. The first has to do with the fact that, as I began to argue a few years ago, public universities in Latin America hurt and they smell. They smell for many reasons, but particularly for their complicities with capitalism, with extractivisms, and I'm thinking of mining, of oil, of fracking, but also extractivisms of knowledge, for systemic racism, for the gendered violences, and with the increasingly transnationalized interests of the corporate state, for their growing alliances with the colonial matrices of power. And they hurt for their masculine, westernized, heteropatriarchal, and colonial ethos. I argued then, and I continue to argue today. For the apathy, the forced silences, and the intellectual indifference that exist in their interior. For their decadence, for their mediocrity, and their myopicness that leave in oblivion the utopias, the struggles, and the gains of social relevance, educational autonomy, interculturality, critical territorial-based thought, and education connected to life itself. If once there was a link between Latin American public higher education and the social reality of the masses, a link rooted in the belief of the role of universities in building a just society, today we are facing something else. The public university as business that advances the commodification and technification of knowledge, and with it the logics and the precepts central to coloniality and capitalism in their current configurations and mutations. Throughout the region, throughout Latin America, the growing gap between social reality and higher education is strikingly clear. So too is the rise of what I call the Dehumanities. The Dehumanities, which I understand as sort of the present day institutionalization and institutionality of racial, gendered, epistemic, and existential violences, and forms of dispossession, war, death, sort of all connected together, that together aim to discipline, to reform, and recolonize humanity, to wrest the humanity of the majority, but also to redefine and reframe humanity itself. I think, for example, the elimination and or the defunding of the humanities and social sciences in many Latin American universities today, which is part and parcel of this trend. But of course, it doesn't stop there. I also think of the cities of knowledge that began about a decade ago, both in Mexico and in Ecuador, both with South Korean financing and technological know-how. Cities as universities that position knowledge as a new productive matrix in which ancestral knowledges of Indigenous and Black communities are considered as commodities, without the necessity, of course, of the ancestors, of the communities, or the peoples themselves. Epistemic extractivism taken to new depths. I think of Bolsonaro's project in Brazil to, in his words, cleanse universities of Black, Indigenous, and gay students and professors, and of what he calls vagabond women. To prohibit discussions that criticize government and engage issues of gender, sexual diversity, and non-Christian religions, encouraging students to film disobedient professors who are then criminalized, and to reestablish so-called traditional values. That is, white, conservative, Christian, heteropatriarchal, Western, universal values. It's interesting that the International Network of Scholars at Risk recently, just a couple months ago, denounced the serious decline in Brazil of academic freedom and institutional autonomy, including government control on ideological grounds of appointments, of higher up authorities, professors, etc., but also the funding of the universities themselves. But I also think of the COVID-related pandemics that contributed throughout Latin America, elsewhere as well, of course, too, but particularly here, to both the privatization and the whitening of public higher education, the elimination of student scholarships, and the permanence of online programs and courses that eliminate social contact, exacerbate mechanisms of evaluation and control, and require technologies that the majority in Latin America do not have. Certainly, without a doubt, COVID has worked to accelerate processes aimed at transforming the mission, the spirit, and the practice of public universities throughout the region, including, and most especially, their social relevance, connection, function, and vocation, as well as who gets to teach and who gets to study within them. These transformations, of course, are driven in large part by development banks, by related international organisms, including UNESCO and the Institute of Higher Education in Latin America, which is UNESCO's institute here in Latin America, whose dictates, standards, financing, and goals, what some even refer to as their neo-colonial reason, work together to bring Latin American universities into the global model of higher education and knowledge, a model that, as many of us know well, strengthens rather than challenges the system and the structures, quantifies intellectual productivity, supports educational privatization, and argues for the systemic nexus of science, progress, innovation, and economic growth, a nexus in which on-site, socially relevant, and grounded classroom-based education is made to appear as antiquated, outdated, and increasingly obsolete. Of course, these trends of academic and cognitive capitalism are certainly not limited to Latin America, but they have a particular significance here because of the more than century-long struggles for university autonomy that began in Argentina in Córdoba in 1918, that also connect to the Latin Americanizations of knowledge and thought that took rise with dependency theory in the 1950s and 60s, but also with the massive and really massive student protests in Chile, in Colombia, and in other places against university privatization and for public education of social relevance and relation just in recent years. Interestingly enough, and maybe Alma, our moderator, can say something about this later, but just a couple weeks ago, the end of June, and as this kind of social, political, epistemic stance of resistance against the globalizing trends, Mexico's National Council of Science and Technology, CONACYT, announced an official government plan for the social transformation of this country's system and structure of graduate education. The aim is to eliminate privatization, simulation, international parameters, including quantifiable productivity, and the vicious circle of privilege and exclusion, and move towards a higher education system based in social relevance, solidarity, and a different notion of scientific rigor. Through national forums and open reflection and discussion just in the past couple weeks has begun about the proposed processes and guidelines of how the transformation might take place and what people in universities throughout Mexico think of that. But of course, as might be expected, it's also sparked a very strong opposition of conservative educators and sectors allied with international entities and transnational interests. Mexico's resistance-based transformation proposition, of course, is good news. Yet one has to wonder, I wonder, how social relevance and scientific rigor will be constructed, construed, and conceived, particularly by a government that continues to push policies and practices that both folklorize and criminalize Indigenous peoples. Policies and practices of violence, a violation of extractivism and dispossession of and on ancestral Indigenous lands. Policies and practices that in all too many ways maintain the colonial matrices of power. But crucial to take into account as well is the Mexican version of intercultural education, one of the themes of this webinar today. The Mexican version that began more than 2 decades ago and continues today. Under this label, under the label of intercultural education, has included a number of state-conceived and state-controlled intercultural universities that offer little more than a substandard technical training for Indigenous students. If intercultural education in Mexico has done little up until now to continue or to confront systemic racism, epistemicides, and social epistemic and existence-based injustice, and a project in practice has been functional to the established structure, system, order. What are we to expect, I ask, from the new state reforms focused on social relevance and scientific rigor in higher education? So that brings me to my second point. A university of the people and for the people, the public university with the people, were the cries here in Ecuador during the national uprising strike that began on June 13th, 2022, just less than a month ago. An uprising strike here led by the Indigenous movement and with the active participation of many other social sectors, including educators and students. The 10-point list of demands that drove the nationwide strike were identified by the Indigenous movement as demands thought for all, demonstration in a sense of how interculturality can work in a plurination. In ways particularly significant, I think, for our discussion here, the 18-day-long uprising strike brought into constant view the huge chasm between social reality and the corporate state, and the huge disparity between social reality and higher education. As tens of thousands of Indigenous community members began on the strike's 9th day to arrive in caravans of trucks and on foot to the capital city here of Quito, the universities that in October 2019 had opened their doors to receive thousands of community members in a similar uprising announced that this time their doors would remain closed, even to those Indigenous protesters who were their students. 2 universities finally succumbed to the pressure of students and faculty, opening their campuses on humanitarian grounds to house thousands of Indigenous women, men, and children. Housing, however, was only a small part of what transpired within. Over the days, the student and faculty volunteers and community members together built spaces of shared reflection and thought on the situation and the condition of the country and the reasons for protest. And they together built spaces of co-learning and co-living in and with dignity, despite severe state-authorized repression, including of gas bombs thrown over and over again into the university installations. In the making was a university of, for, and with the people of this culturally diverse plurination. Is this not part, I ask, of the making, doing of epistemic justice, decolonization, and intercultural education? My university, once considered the most progressive in the country and the Andean region, most especially for its strong relation for many, many years with social movements, its announced intercultural focus, and its spaces of critical, socially grounded, and decolonializing thought, refused to open its doors. Our petitions, our manifestos, our pronouncements to university officials were denied. In the social media, a continuous wave of messages circulated expressing the indignation of many who had studied here, been part of activities and public events, and thought that this university was somehow different. As one tweet said, "Don't drop the discourse. The most the most decolonial process is open your doors now. The large poster-sized papers plastered one night on the long street-side wall of the institution seem to say it all. In your classes, you talk about decolonial thought, said one poster paper. In your classes, you talk about human rights, about privilege, about interculturality. Another paper, in your archives of thousands of research studies, theses, and articles on Indigenous peoples and social struggles. But at the end of the long line of plaster papers on this wall, the last two were maybe the most significant. And what they said is, what is going on in reality is that thousands are sleeping on the streets. What is going on in reality is that the people will not forget your indifference. Certainly, the lessons here are great, not only for this university, my place of political, pedagogical, teaching and struggle for the last 25 years. But what happens, I ask, when indifference becomes the characterizing feature of what once was considered socially, politically, and territorially grounded education? What about the notion, as CRY, of universities of, for, and with the people? And how now, in these times, to cultivate and sustain the processes and practices of decolonizing and interculturalizing otherwises, of pluriversalizations and epistemic interculturalizations and decolonizations that many of us have struggled to build within these institutions, the system, despite them, spiting. I am not, we are not the university institution, some of us say. Yet in the eyes of many, we are. We professors are the institution, many think. And herein lies the reality and dilemma. So finally, my final point. I stopped believing many years ago in the possibility of large-scale social transformation, including, but not only in the sphere of higher education. My posture, position, and intention are to the decolonial fissures and cracks. The fissures and cracks that exist inside, outside, and despite the system's apparent totality, perceived by many as a kind of concrete wall. My political pedagogical labor is about making, opening, widening, and connecting the cracks, a labor that is never done alone, but always in company with others. For me, the cracks are where the possibilities of epistemic justices, decolonizations, and interculturalizations do and can take form. I think, for example, of the open, autonomous, and community-based Universidades de la Tierra, universities of the earth, that began several decades ago in Mexico, first in Oaxaca and Chiapas, then extending in name elsewhere, including most recently to Bogota, Colombia. These are the universities of, for, and with the people, without the incidence or interference of private interests or state, each with their own territorial roots and reason. As Colombia's University of the Earth, named to recall and give life to the memory of Orlando Faz Borda, Colombia's sociologist strongly tied to community-based processes and participatory research, participatory action research. As this university describes itself, it's a network of collectives, of community-based organizations, activists, artists, feminists, community leaders, and wise people, popular educators, and educators from universities in Colombia and the region, who work from contra-hegemonic postures, pedagogical postures, centered around the defense of life. And this as an articulator of the emancipatory processes of territories and communities. I think of Huracan, the University of Regional Autonomies of Nicaragua's Caribbean coast, officially formed in the early 90s as an intercultural community-based university, an institutional life project with a philosophy and vision aimed, in the university's words, at revitalizing, promoting, and strengthening the exercise of collective rights, identities, worldviews, spiritualities, forms of organization, cultures, knowledge systems, and practices, and aimed as well at developing processes from the decolonization of thought to the strengthening of autonomies, intercultural citizenship, and buen vivir of indigenous peoples, Afro-descendants, mestizo, and other ethnic communities of Abya Yala. But I also think of the network of indigenous intercultural community universities of Abya Yala, Lucay, in which Huracan is also part, that over the years has included indigenous, intercultural, and community-based universities in Mexico, Guatemala, Ecuador, Bolivia, Panama, Colombia, Venezuela, Chile, and Peru, and Argentina. Of consideration as well are many other community-based experiences throughout the region without, and many not seeking, state recognition. I understand all of these instances, Huracan, the network I just mentioned, and the universities of the earth, as experiences of and from the fissures and cracks of the top-down and increasingly globalized higher education structure and system. Some with state recognition and others without. All make central the relation of knowledge and life, and the urgency of decolonizing and interculturalizing precepts, visions, and praxis. All work to build, and each in their own territory, context, and ways, an alternative and an otherwise of universities and so-called higher education. While the dominant educational system has functionalized intercultural education in ethnic and inclusionary terms, an education focused on indigenous and Afro-descendant populations under policies and practices of inclusion within the established structure, the examples that I just mentioned point to a radically distinct understanding that links interculturality and decolonization in educations of and for the defense of life, of and for community versus individualism or individuality, and of and for the sustenance and making with others of radically distinct social realities, existences, and ways of thinking, knowing, being. Yet for many in Latin America who continue to teach and study in universities, increasingly allied with the globalizing project, what do the key words of this webinar, epistemic justice, decolonization, and intercultural education suggest, rouse, activate, provoke, and trigger? For me, they necessarily evoke, beseech, incite, and invoke the work of crack making, of making, widening, and connecting decolonial and decolonizing cracks and fissures within against the institutions themselves. The cracks, in this sense, are the spaces of an other knowledge and thought that build intercultural and interepistemic relation, that foster a thinking from and with instead of a studying about, and that tie the processes and practices of learning, unlearning, relearning, and co-learning to live social reality here in Avellana, Latin America, encouraging conversations with other territories as well, most especially with the cracks present and emergent throughout the global South and the South and the global North. The cracks, of course, are not the solutions to the academic and cognitive capitalism, commodification, and ever-present and ever-shifting colonial matrices of power in which systemic racism, gendering, heteropatriarchy, etc. are central cogs. The cracks instead are the possibility of the otherwises within, despite, and despite the system, that give shimmers of hope in the midst of the grayness of despair. But most of all, they are a call to action against the indifference of all too many higher education institutions today. The cracks exist, persist, and resist in a multitude of ways, including through pedagogical praxis, engender as something else, in which the hows of epistemic interculturalizations, decolonizations, and pluriversalizations can and do take form. The hows, of course, bring forth the doing. So I end with a simple muse and a question. Maybe, just maybe, if we make enough cracks in the present day system and structure of higher education in Latin America, the wall will begin to crumble and fall. Is this not what epistemic justice, decolonization, and intercultural education are, or at least should be about? So I end there. Thank you, and I look forward to Regina's comments.
Thank you very much, Catherine. We appreciate a lot your comments, very interesting points you just made. And now I will pass the mic to Regina for her remarks, and then we will start with the discussion and questions and comments.
Thank you. Thank you, Alma and Simon, for the invitation and opportunity to comment on the remarks by Catherine Walsh. During these few minutes that I have to discuss the thought-provoking ideas of Catherine, I would like to emphasize that her idea of the colonial fissures and cracks is useful. In my comments, I would like to expand on the decolonial fissures and cracks that are present in higher education. I would like to start to push back a little bit on Catherine's suggestion that Mexican intercultural universities offer little more than technical learning for indigenous students. The world of intercultural universities in Mexico today is larger than the original 10 founded by federal and state funds. Their numbers have increased dramatically as part of some state university systems. For example, the Universidad Veracruzana has 4 intercultural campuses in different regions of the state. Those campuses offer a bachelor program in intercultural education and community development, 2 new programs on agroecology and food sovereignty, and 1 on indigenous law and governance. One successful outcome of higher education institution getting closer to the communities is that approximately 50% of the students in these universities are indigenous women. They have been able to gain access to higher education while remaining in their communities. Another important outcome is that 1/3 of the students in these institutions are speakers of one of the 68 official indigenous languages. In fact, the Universidad Veracruzana has successfully implemented a master's program to develop writing skills and perfect students' use of Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs. This is the language most widely spoken in Mexico after Spanish. The decolonization that is taking place on the ground level, breaking the gender and race hierarchies that have persisted over time, is one example of how a state policy is capable of allowing for fissures and cracks in the access to and the experience of university education. Beyond the universities just mentioned and those identified by Catherine, there are many other intercultural universities established in different regions. For example, in Oaxaca, there are community-based universities, not all of them autonomous from the state, that is the case of Unitierra. For example, there is the Universidad Comunal de Oaxaca and the privately funded Instituto Superior Cultural Ayuc. To illustrate the importance of these institutions beyond imparting technical education, I would like to share one of the quotes from an indigenous woman and faculty member that I interviewed in March for a manuscript that I will publish soon. She refers to the Instituto Ayuc. This is a multilingual space. From the autonomous, political, and educational perspectives of their communities, they recognize the problems and solutions they can implement with the population in which they are part. They are loyal to their own linguistic and cultural ways of advancing community-based education. It is not the intercultural education that is expressed in the laws or in the regulations, but another way of teaching and learning. The question is just one of many examples of political and pedagogical practice that show how the cracks and the colonial fissures are advancing through interculturalization. Yet, as Catherine points out, in spite of many advances on the ground level and within institutions working for and with indigenous people, there is still much to be done at the policy level and within the administrative structures to decolonize the university. Internal policies and practices need to be changed to achieve a pluriversity and to break the gender and race hierarchies imposed by the colonial matrix. In a recent article on mine on how gender hierarchies are maintained in the National University of Mexico, UNAM. My co-author and I show that even though women represent almost 50% of the teaching faculty, their presence decreases among prestigious research positions and leadership positions. The presence of women is also diminished by the lack of visibilization, the proper recognition of their scholarly work, and through the citation and acknowledgement of their theoretical contributions. Thus, a gender script persists in internal policies and practices that regulate academic employment. These policies and practices, as well as the criteria embedded in the nomination of academics as distinguished member of their profession, contributes to making women present in academia invisible. At the policy level, we see hopeful advances in some of the Latin American countries. A good example is the commitment of Gustavo Petro, the newly elected president of Colombia, to eliminate the dependence on extractive industries. In Chile, the Constitutional Commission, led by an indigenous woman, successfully created a new constitution that gives rights to indigenous people and to the Mother Earth. It's too early to say how these commitments are going to transform the universities or affect the production of knowledge. My final comment is related to Mexico and the new policy of graduate training. The current president of Mexico, through what he calls the fourth transformation or 4T, has inflicted tremendous damage to higher education institutions. His administration commitment to support investment to expand access to higher education stands in sharp contrast to other federal actions that he has initiated, such as the decision on October 21st, 2020, to eliminate 109 public trusts or fideicomisos, some of which support long-term research in the most advanced higher education centers in the country. 91 of these public trusts supported research in CINVESTAV, where Alma is, in CIDE, en el Colegio de la Frontera Norte. Other funds supported artists and cultural institutions, all in the name of eliminating corruption. In the president's controversial move, more than $3 million were removed from all of these institutions. In a parallel action, the National System for Research, under the administration of CONACYT, the National Council for Science and Technology, informed private universities in Mexico that the researchers working in those institutions will no longer be able to participate in the Sistema Nacional de Investigadores. Although membership has historically depended on individual academic productivity, not on institutional affiliation, this represents a significant setback for researchers in private institutions that receive a monthly supplement for their very low wages. So to summarize, as Catherine Walsh has shown in her remarks, Latin American countries are maintaining coloniality through policy and practices, but there are also fissures and cracks through which they are encouraging conversations toward epistemic justice and decolonization. Thank you, Catherine, for your work and for the wonderful presentation you just gave.
Thank you very much, Regina. Thank you, Catherine. We have some questions. Let's wait a little bit in order to get some more. Obviously, as my privilege as a chair, I will make also some comments and I appreciate a lot the opportunity. Let me just say that this is such a fascinating discussion in Latin America today, right? Decolonization, what is happening, current policies. As a disclaimer, let me just say that I am a left-wing voter. I have voted twice for current populist President López Obrador, not this last time. So I don't consider myself a conservative scholar at all, but it's interesting that you mentioned it, Catherine, this latest announcement on the transformation on graduate programs, because this is such a great example to discuss what would be my worry and my question to you. To what extent this idea of creating these cracks and to continue with these cracks at some point will diminish the capacity building of the countries in a way things that have been so difficult to build now are destroyed. And in the case of the graduate program, this PNPC in Spanish, this is a program that was created in 1991. And obviously it's a very controversial program because it has benefits, it has negative points. We have discussed a lot this program, but the problem with the announcement 2 weeks ago is that they announced the destruction of this program without any solution and without any other mechanism on how are we going to do things now. So I am not going into the further details of what is happening, how this director of CONACYT made the announcement, but my main point is they announced they are going to destroy the program, and we don't know what is going to happen with the support of to students, because this program has been so important to continue the development of graduate education in Mexico, for good and for bad. I mean, we can discuss, but the arguments expressed by the authorities are not quite accurate in terms of saying, well, this program created the disadvantages for humanities and arts. It's not true. This program promoted the privatization of graduate education. It's not true. We have the data there. We have the data on what were the benefits of this program. So when we are looking to transform in that way the systems, we are also approaching to this condition where we will be destroying all these efforts that our countries have created with so many difficulties. So I think that is one point to take into consideration and to discuss, obviously, and to open the floor here to debate. The other thing is about intercultural universities, and I see here Gunther, who is the expert in Mexico on intercultural universities. Obviously, he knows everything about these universities, but I just would like to say that one of the problems, and we have discussed this before, when you have these intercultural universities, is the other segregation that you create with graduates, with the students, and with only offering one opportunity and one chance of type of program, whether these communities and this population will deserve to have the chance and the opportunity to get enrolled in whatever type of program of type of institutions they would like. So I think those are some of the topics. Obviously, the third one has to do with the, you mentioned it, Catherine, scholars at risk. Well, in Mexico, we are dealing with a regime right now that is persecuting academics, that is closing or at least destroying research centers such as CIDE, which was a big issue. And besides all the financial issues that Regina mentioned. But anyway, I took too much time, sorry, but obviously it's a topic I am really involved right now. So I asked Kyria if she would like to make her question, so please.
Thank you, Alma. Thank you, Catherine, so much for your talk. And if there are any other questions, then Catherine preferred to focus on other, perhaps most important questions, please feel free to do so. Catherine, we've started in Brazil in our research group to study decolonial theory, mostly from a Latin American perspective. And so we've been reading your work, Alma, and other people in Brazil and in our research group. And lately, we've come across the text that included in the chat from David Block, from a Marxist perspective, and then I relate to what Alma was saying as a leftist. And apparently, one of the criticisms that they have raised against decolonial theory is for focusing too much on recognition issues such as race, focusing too much on race, instead of focusing on issues related to the redistribution of issues in terms of allowing social justice. And so I was wondering, how do you feel about this? Do you think that perhaps these cracks and fissures that you mentioned could be a way perhaps to start, of course, with recognition, but go beyond recognition into redistribution by looking at other issues that are related to social justice? So that is my question, and thank you very much for this opportunity.
So Alma, is it okay if I go answering Kyria's question, your questions, and then if more?
Okay, let's go to the other two questions. Yes, please.
Okay. Well, thank you, Kyria. As you know, Kyria, I also have long connections with Brazil and conversations continuing. So I really appreciate your questions and comments. For me, I think there's two issues at play here. One is that what is the decolonial struggle against the system, and how do we name that system? And so in contexts, particularly of Latin America, we know that the racialization, but also gender and sexuality, have been issues that have really marked the higher education sphere for centuries. That isn't to eliminate class. We know certainly that race, gender, sexuality, and class are all intertwined, right? So in one sense, to focus the problem against this system, but also at the same time to think of what we want to construct, what are we working for, right? So in our universities and our research projects, et cetera, what do we want to change? What do we want to build? So it's not just criticizing, but it's building something distinct. And so I think the issues of looking at who the students are, or what the context that we're talking about, are extremely important. So in my mind, we can't just only focus on class, but class doesn't disappear. Class is intertwined in many, many ways, particularly in these times where impoverishment is growing and growing in the Latin American context, as we all know. So I think that's important to sort of think of the intertwines. And many of the Marxist critiques of decolonial perspectives that say class is not there, probably look at sort of as an outside view, but not looking at the praxis-based work of decoloniality, right? Where class is always part of living. And so the ways that racialization, genderization, heteropatriarchy intertwine with class, I think, are key. So and there's much more I could say, but for issues of time, Kyria, I'll leave it there, but really thank you. And also, Alma, I wanted to just really briefly respond to some of your excellent reflections. I think the problem for me, when I think about what's going on in Mexico, but what's going on other places, and I make the parallels of what we lived here during a so-called progressive government of 10 years of Rafael Correa and what happened in the higher education sphere, there's many parallels with what's going on right now in Mexico. So it's sort of this issue of top-down transformation where the state decides what's good for everybody, right? And comes in and says, okay, we're going to establish something new with the word new as a way to sort of modernize the system, but destroying, as you say, Alma, of other things that existed before that work, that have shown that they work. So it's this notion of so-called progressive state authority that seems to know what's best for everybody, and then implements it, destroying many of the processes built within, which here in Ecuador were disaster in the field of higher education, not only higher education, but because we're focusing on higher education now, it's important. So I think when I'm thinking about the issue of cracks, it's not to destroy what exists and what works. So also, as Regina mentioned, there are many other intercultural university experiences in Veracruzana, those that Gunther has been involved in for many years, and many other places, not just in Mexico, throughout Latin America, that totally work. And so the idea is not to criticize those, but what happens when state designs a structure, as they did in the beginning with the 10 intercultural universities, right? That seems to presume a notion of what intercultural is. And I think that connects to Alma's second comment of intercultural universities as in some way a space of segregation. But if we understand intercultural as the building of relation, of a transforming of the way, not just bringing different bodies together, but different knowledges, different logics, different ways of living and being in the world, right? That necessarily cannot be done in a segregated setting. So the notion that the intercultural university is for indigenous students or for Afro-descendant students, but not for mestizo or white identified students is wrong, right? Intercultural should be building a process of working and thinking together, of building different inter-epistemic possibilities. What happens, not just in Mexico, but in many other places in Latin America, is that intercultural is a sign, is a determining word that means indigenous, or maybe means Afro-descendant, but seldom means education for white mestizo populations. Here in Ecuador, we have a national law that's called Intercultural Education for Everybody. But what it does is perpetuate the same notion of functionalizing interculturality. So those intercultural students are really the indigenous or Afro-descendant students, right? That have to be brought into the fold, brought into a dominant society, right? The notion of politics of inclusion. So I think challenging the notion of how we understand interculturality, intercultural education is extremely important, because it has to point towards what we want to build. Do we want to simply maintain segregated, or to use Kirya's word, recognition-based programs? Or do we want to build a different way of thinking where different knowledges, different logics, different cosmologies of the world begin to intertwine and converse with one another? And so I think those are the kinds of issues that need to come into place today.
Okay, thank you, Catherine. We have about 6 minutes just to conclude the session. And I would like to ask Ariadna Garza, sorry, and Madeline to ask their questions, and then we will proceed with the question. Thank you.
Hey, it's been a real pleasure to listen to the discussions here. I just wanted to make a comment in regard to the things that are happening in Mexico and that has been discussed, because for me, what is more challenging is to observe that our university communities are not expressing a concern about the governmental decisions. And this thing drives me to the final idea that Catherine expressed about building and thinking together. I think as universities, as scientific communities, we should contribute with the government in the decisions that are taken, and this is not the case in Mexico, and maybe that is one of the biggest errors, mistakes that the president did, because while not taking into account the population that is going to live or to act with the new rules, it's very complicated, because now, as you mentioned, there are groups that are opposing to the changes, but there are also groups of scientists and universities in outside of Mexico City that do not have enough resources, that we are in very bad situation in regard to equipment, infrastructure, and things. So for me, the most important thing is that the universities in Mexico are not expressing a concern, the scientists are not expressing a concern, and that is due that, to the fact that we are not building and thinking together. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Madeline, please.
Hello, I hope you can hear me. Thank you very much, both speakers, really fascinating, so much to take, so thank you. My question was coming kind of from a broader perspective, just thinking about if you consider that maybe decolonial endeavors have been diluted by the contributions of white academics or activists, specifically within the global north, often from former colonial states, etc. And your kind of reflections on that argument around that within higher education, and then more specifically within kind of intercultural learning, or just kind of your general reflections would be brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you, Madeleine. And then Leandro's mic doesn't work, so let me just read his comment. He says, I would like to make a comment to get Catherine's reaction. It's hard to accept that a so-called progressive government as López Obrador's first changes policies and programs with no evidence to support such transformation, and later it reacts to stakeholders' positions, opinions, and criticisms. There seems to be a preference for top-down public policies that can be considered a proper progressive way to move towards more a democratic academia and national system of research. And thank you very much. As a concluding remarks, I will ask Catherine, and I don't know if Regina would like to say something else, and then we will finish this session. So, Catherine.
Okay, thank you, Alma. With regards to Aridiana's comments, I keep thinking, like I mentioned before, of the experience that we lived here in Ecuador and the parallel with what's happening in Mexico now. So when Ecuador's government of Rafael Correa from 2007 to 2017, 10 years, began a reform of higher education, it worked to silence in many ways those of us in the universities, because criticism was viewed as conservative, as right-wing, as against the progressive government. So this kind of notion that Adriana mentioned of universities not taking into account or not expressing concern about what is happening is in part that fear, right? So that if you come against it, that it's a supposed progressive or left-wing transformation. If you question that, therefore you're marked, right, as being against the government, as being conservative, as not taking into account the need for social transformation. So that kind of strategy, which has been also played out in different ways in other so-called progressive governments in the region, is important to take into account. So I think against what's beginning, these forums beginning to take place in Mexico, what happens if universities organize their own forums without being organized by the state, to begin to discuss within? What does our university look like? What has worked? What have we done over the years, right? What do we need in terms of support from a state, but not a state policy that tells us what we have to do? So I think that's important to take into account. And in many ways that connects with Leandro's comments, right? How can a top-down government policy take into account not just the diversity of university institutions in Mexico, being such a huge country, right? With huge variations of education, higher education, but also how does it mark what we might say is the breaking down of a democratic system that Leandro mentioned, right? So that the issue that state knows best, progressive state knows best, progressive masculinized states know best, repeats this sort of notion that democracy is constructed from the top down, is constructed by state. And so what are the possibilities of building other forms of more participatory democracy to discuss the issues? Yes, maybe taking distance from quantifiable productivity is important, right? Maybe discussing privilege as it exists in some institutions, obviously UNAM being very different than institutions in the south of Mexico and other places, right? But I think to sort of build processes of thinking from the ground up, from within university, with students, with faculty, and with community members involved with universities locally is an extremely necessary process to sort of turn upside down what has begun in Mexico, but is certainly not limited to Mexico. Because as I said, we live this in Ecuador, Argentina is in similar processes. We could mention Chile and Colombia that are beginning to rethink higher education from new government positions, etc. So finally, Madeline, I think it's important to understand, for me, decolonial perspectives, I prefer to talk about decolonial perspectives and not theory, because I think what decoloniality offers is a perspective of reading the world, of being in the world, but also of constructing other spaces. It's not just an abstract theoretical position, nor is it a theoretical position that's necessarily racialized per se. So that I think the work of scholars in the global north to begin to think about what it means to begin to build decolonizing perspectives in this context of higher education that we're talking about are important contributions, because all of us form part of what we can call this colonial system or colonial matrix of power. All of us are participants in that in different ways. And so how do we work within our institutions, outside our institutions, opening fissures in our institutions, but particularly within our classrooms and with students, to build other logics of thought? And that has to happen in the global north, just as it has to happen in the global south. And it has to build debates and conversations between the both, to look at the souths that exist in the norths that exist in the south, etc. So it's not just a place where scholars of color have the voice, but where all of us are challenged or have to face the dilemma of how do we begin to break down this system that in many ways, both in the North and the South, tries to determine what higher education is, particularly in these globalizing times. So Madeline, I think that's the issue that brings us together, so that while this webinar is about higher education in Latin America, it's making threads of connection to other places in the world as well. So I want to thank Alma, Regina, and Simon for this opportunity to share some thoughts with all of you today. And hopefully this discussion will continue to develop in other places in the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Regina. We are out of time now, unfortunately, but thank you, Regina, for being here.
I just want to say one thing.
Yes.
I think it's really important to see the situation of Mexico different than the one in Ecuador, because what Correa did is that he standardized the evaluation of universities, and through evaluation was controlling the universities. I think in this case, we are seeing a government that is removing vital resources for the survival of the university, and and without a policy in which the university is communicating, because the university used to control the programs, and now they said they're going to control by the government. So I think it's a very important discussion that we need to continue, because for me it's the continuation of the fideicomisos, another step of removal more of the financial resources that support university education in Mexico. And I think that it is not that he's progressive, no, I think he believes, he doesn't trust the university. For him, they are all neoliberals. He's destroying CIDE. So I think it's really important to be very watchful. And I don't think that the government has the right to remove as Alma said very well, something that the university has built for so long without any way of dialoguing, because the decision has been taken. Now he's going to dialogue. That's not how things work. First you dialogue and then you make decisions. Anyway, but thank you so much, Catherine. It was a pleasure, and thank you, Alma, and thank you everybody that is here.
Well, thank you, Simon, for the invitation, for chairing this session. And I don't know if you want to say one final word, but I appreciate everybody.
We're enormously grateful to Catherine and Regina for their contribution, and to you too, Alma and Kyria and all the others who spoke today. And the series has been really good for us. I think it's helped us bring Latin America to a larger global audience. Remember that people will watch these shows on YouTube, and there'll be more people watching the webinars on YouTube than will watch them live. So they'll be on the record for a long time to come. And what's been said today will be remembered and used by many people over the years. We would like to return to Latin America and have another series next year, possibly. Perhaps we need 6 or 8 sessions rather than 4, because this was very rich for us. And we had great speakers. There's so many good voices, so many good ideas, and so many countries to address as well. So yeah, again, thank you to everyone. Our next webinar is about the making of a documentary on international students in the UK, students from China, and it's actually by a very good group of critical, young critical journalists who've come out of media studies and did a really brilliant expose of the international education industry in UK and its exploitative character. So I really recommend that. That's in 2 days' time on Thursday, led by Lisa Kamenov. So look forward to seeing everyone in the future again. Look forward to seeing our speakers back again. And I'll say bye for now.
Thank you.